You sit down to do one thing. Maybe it's an email, maybe it's actual work you need to get done. And then 20 minutes later, you're watching a video about a topic you've never cared about on a platform you didn't even mean to open, and you genuinely cannot retrace the steps that got you there. There's no memory of deciding to go, you just ended up there. Most people call that laziness, or weak willpower, or some personal flaw they need to fix with more discipline, a better morning routine, another productivity system they won't stick to. But that framing is wrong, and I think you already sense that, because you've tried fixing it, and it keeps happening anyway. What's actually going on has a name that predates the internet by about 2,000 years. Taoist texts described it as the scattering of Shen, the dispersed spirit, and they understood exactly how it worked and what it cost you. They didn't have smartphones, they didn't have notification badges or infinite scroll, and they still saw this coming. This video is about what they knew, what Shen actually is, why the modern world scatters it faster than any period in history, what you lose when it goes, and what the Taoist system for protecting it actually looks like in practice. What Shen actually is. Before anything else, get the Western framing out of your head. In the West, focus is a skill. You build it like a muscle through practice and repetition. You have more of it on some days, less on others, and the assumption is that the problem lives inside you, some capacity you haven't developed enough yet. Taoists looked at this completely differently. Shen isn't a skill, it's a resource closer to a substance, and like any resource, it can be replenished, depleted, scattered, or preserved. The quality of your attention at any given moment depends on the current state of your Shen, not on your character. To understand where Shen sits, you need to know the three treasures, Jing, Qi, and Shen. Jing is your foundational physical vitality, the densest and slowest of the three. Qi is the animating energy that runs through everything, the current that keeps the body functioning. Shen sits at the top of that hierarchy. It's the most refined, the most responsive to the environment, and the most easily disturbed. Think of the three as layers of the same system, each one feeding into the next, with Shen being the surface where everything becomes conscious experience. Taoist teachers used a specific image to describe how Shen works. Picture a candle flame in a room with no wind. It burns straight, steady, clear. Now, open a window. The flame doesn't go out, it just starts pulling sideways, flickering, splitting into competing directions. The flame isn't damaged, the candle is still perfectly good, but the draft won't let it settle, so the light it produces becomes unreliable and weak. Your attention works the same way. The draft is the problem, not the flame. There's a second image they used just as often, sediment in water. If you fill a jar with muddy water and leave it completely still, the sediment settles on its own. The water clears. No effort required, no special technique, just the absence of agitation. Shen works on the same principle. It naturally wants to consolidate and settle. The clarity you're looking for isn't something you generate through effort. It's something that returns when you stop disturbing it. This distinction matters more than it might seem at first. If focus is a skill you lack, the solution is to train harder. If Shen is a resource being continuously disturbed, the solution is to remove what's doing the disturbing. Those two answers point in completely opposite directions, and most people spend years pursuing the first one, while the second one sits there ignored. So when you sit down to work and can't hold a thought for more than 90 seconds, that's not a character flaw, it's a flame in a draft. The question worth asking isn't, what's wrong with me? It's, what's creating the wind? Why the modern world is a Shen scattering machine. So if Shen is the flame, the modern digital environment is a wind tunnel built by engineers who studied exactly how to keep it flickering. Taoism has a concept called wei, which roughly means artificial forcing or interference. It's the opposite of wu wei, the principle of moving with the natural flow of things rather than against it. Wei is what happens when something imposes itself on a system that would otherwise find its own balance. And if you want to understand what your phone is doing to your attention, Wei is the right word for it. Every app on your device is a Wei machine. It's not designed to serve your intentions, it's designed to interrupt them. The specific mechanisms are not accidental. Variable reward schedules, where you don't know if the next scroll will bring something interesting or not, create a pull that's almost impossible to resist passively. Incompletion queues, the unread badge, the unanswered message, the thread you didn't finish, generate a background tension that Taoist texts would recognize immediately. They wrote specifically about incompletion as one of the primary enemies of settled spirit because an unresolved thing keeps pulling Shen outward toward it. Every open loop in your environment is a small but continuous drain, and the notifications aren't just interruptions. Each one is what Taoist teachers described as the spirit-chasing phenomena, where Shen moves outward to chase an external object before it's had any time to consolidate. One ping and Shen rushes toward it. Another ping, it rushes somewhere else. By the time you return to the thing you were trying to do, the flame has been yanked around so many times it can't hold a direction. The number that makes this concrete, the average person checks their phone 96 times a day. That's not 96 brief pauses. That's 96 separate moments where whatever Shen had managed to gather gets pulled apart again before it can do anything useful. And the gap between each one is rarely long enough for any real settling to happen. You're essentially keeping the jar of water in constant motion and then wondering why it won't clear. Here's the part that should actually change how you feel about this, because this is where the validation hook from the thumbnail lands. This is not personal failure, it is a predictable outcome. You have a biological system built over thousands of years that requires periods of low stimulation and settled attention to function properly, and you're running that system inside an environment specifically engineered by very smart people to prevent those periods from ever occurring. The chaos isn't coming from inside you, it's coming from outside, and it's being deliberately generated. The compounding effect is the piece most people miss. Shen doesn't just scatter and then snap back easily the moment the input stops. The more it scatters, the harder it becomes to reassemble. Think about trying to gather smoke with your hands. One small wisp is easy enough to cup, but if it's been dispersing for hours in every direction, there's almost nothing left to work with by the time you try. That's what a full day of phones, feeds, and tab switching does. By evening, the capacity for deep attention isn't just tired, it's genuinely fragmented, and the next morning it starts from a deficit. Everyone in this environment is dealing with the same thing. The person who seems focused and productive isn't doing so because they have stronger willpower or better character. They've either structured their environment differently or they haven't yet noticed how bad things have gotten. The attention crisis isn't happening because this generation is weaker. It's happening because the environment changed faster than any natural adaptation could possibly follow. And scattered Shen doesn't just make you less productive, it takes something from you that goes much deeper than that. What do you actually lose when Shen scatters? Most conversations about attention stop at productivity. You can't focus, so you get less done, so you feel behind, so you try harder to focus. That loop is real, but it's the surface layer. What Taoist medicine actually mapped when it described scattered, Shen goes much further than output. Taoists connected Shen directly to something they called Ji, which translates roughly as discernment, the capacity to know what's actually true in a situation versus what just feels urgent. Ji isn't intelligence. You don't develop it through reading or reasoning. It comes online when Shen is settled and coherent, and it goes offline when Shen is fragmented. So a scattered person isn't less smart. They're working with a compromised instrument of perception, and no amount of raw intelligence compensates for that. A surgeon with shaking hands isn't less skilled, they're just unable to apply the skill they have. This is why people in a state of chronic distraction make worse decisions even on things they genuinely care about. They can't reliably distinguish between what matters and what's just loud. Urgency and importance feel identical when G isn't available to sort them. So you spend your afternoon on the thing that kept pinging you instead of the thing you actually needed to do, and by evening you can't fully explain why. Just that it felt pressing at the time. The physical dimension of this was well documented in Taoist medicine. Chronic Shen depletion was linked to sleep disruption, an agitated quality of mind that can't settle even when the body is exhausted. It was linked to anxiety, specifically the kind that doesn't attach to a clear cause, the ambient, low-level dread that a lot of people now treat as a personality trait rather than a symptom. And it was linked to a feeling that practitioners described as not being fully present in one's own life, going through the motions of a day while feeling slightly removed from it, like watching yourself from a small distance. If that description sounds familiar, it's because it maps almost exactly onto what researchers now call screen fatigue, and what a lot of people just call feeling off without being able to say why. But the subtlest cost is the hardest to name and the most damaging over time. Shen is what connects you to your own interior. It's the medium through which you know what you actually want, what you actually think, what you actually feel before the noise gets to it. When it's continuously scattered outward toward external signals, you lose touch with that interior. You're still making choices, still having opinions, still expressing preferences, but you're building all of that from the outside in. You're navigating by reaction instead of by genuine sensing. Most people in this state don't notice it as a loss. They just notice that everything feels slightly flat, that nothing lands as deeply as it used to, that they're busy and stimulated, but rarely satisfied. That flatness isn't depression, and it isn't a mood. It's what it feels like when the part of you that registers depth is too scattered to register anything cleanly. The Taoists didn't just diagnose this, they built a specific system to reverse it. The Taoist system for protecting Shen. The instinct most people have when they realize their attention is broken is to apply more force, more discipline, stricter rules, harder boundaries, set a timer, block the apps, white-knuckle your way through a work session. And that instinct makes sense if you believe focus is a skill you need to build up. But as we saw earlier, Shen doesn't work that way. You can't force it into stillness. Effort is itself a form of agitation. What the Taoists built wasn't a willpower system. It was an environmental design system, a way of arranging the conditions so that Shen could do what it naturally does when left alone. The first practice is called Jing. It translates as stillness or quietude, but the word doesn't mean sitting cross-legged doing nothing. It means deliberate removal of stimulation for a defined period each day. No input, no tasks, no consumption, not meditation as performance, where you're trying to achieve some particular inner state, just a period where the outside world stops sending things in. Taoist practitioners treated Jing not as a luxury or a spiritual exercise, but as basic maintenance, the same category as eating or sleeping. Without it, Shen has no window in which to settle, because the input never actually stops. The second practice is what classical texts called guarding the sense gates. The idea is that Shen disperses primarily through the senses, eyes most of all. Every image, sound and notification that enters through those gates pulls Shen outward toward it. The Taoist position wasn't that sensory experience is bad, it's that volume and variety beyond a certain threshold prevent any coherent inner state from forming. So, guarding the sense gates in practice means reducing what you let in before it enters, not filtering after the fact. The modern equivalent is the phone in another room, not in your pocket, where it still registers as a present object, pulling low-level attention even when the screen is dark. The third practice is what they call single-pointed engagement, doing one thing completely rather than several things in parallel, because Shen consolidates around complete, undivided attention, the way a fire consolidates when you stop spreading fuel across too wide an area. Multitasking in Taoist terms isn't a productivity failure, it's a structural impossibility for Shen. You're not splitting your focus between tasks, you're continuously pulling Shen away from one thing before it can fully land on it. So nothing ever gets the quality of attention that makes the work feel real or the experience feel present. Running through all three of these practices is a concept from Taoist cultivation called Shu Yi, which means guarding the one. The basic practice involves returning attention to a single point whenever it wanders, not as a punishment for wandering, but as a gentle repeated redirection back. No frustration, no judgment, just a return. Contemporary mindfulness practice is largely built on this same principle, though the Taoist version was understood specifically in terms of reassembling Shen rather than achieving calm. The calm is a byproduct of coherence, not the goal itself. None of this requires a dramatic life change. The practical version of the Taoist system looks like this: a period each morning before any external input reaches you, a work block where a single task gets your complete attention and the phone is physically somewhere else, and a deliberate transition between activities that gives Shen time to release one thing before it attaches to the next. That's it. 3 structural choices that reduce what's doing the scattering. The Taoist insight that holds all of this together is simple and keeps getting missed. You don't reclaim scattered attention by trying harder to focus. You reclaim it by stopping what's breaking it apart. What reclaiming Shen's looks like in practice. Here's what actually trips people up when they try to apply any of this. The first few days feel worse. You reduce the input, you put the phone in the other room, you sit down to do one thing without anything else running in the background, and instead of feeling clear and calm, you feel restless, uncomfortable, slightly irritable. The absence of stimulation reads as boredom. The quiet feels wrong, and most people interpret that as evidence that the approach isn't working, so they go back to the noise. The Taoist framing for that discomfort is worth holding on to. When you stop agitating the jar, the water doesn't clear instantly. For a moment it actually looks worse, because the sediment that was spread evenly through the whole jar is now visibly sinking, moving through the water before it reaches the bottom. The cloudiness you see on day 2 isn't deterioration, it's the process working. Shen has been calibrated to constant stimulation, and the absence of it initially registers as deprivation. That feeling is not a signal to stop. It's a sign that something is actually shifting. The Tao Te Ching has a word for this movement: fu, return. It describes the natural tendency of things to move back toward their source when the interference stops, not because you force them back, but because returning is what they were always going to do once the obstruction cleared. Your attention works on that same principle. You don't rebuild it. You stop blocking its return and then stay out of the way while it comes back. The minimum viable version of this practice is 1 protected hour. Not a morning routine with 7 components, not a whole system overhaul. 1 hour a day where Shen isn't being pulled outward, before the phone, before the news, before the first message of the day demands a response. A single task, a single window, no queued up inputs waiting. That hour is not a productivity strategy. It's the window in which the instrument of perception gets to recalibrate. What comes back when you do this consistently isn't what most people expect. They're aiming for better output, sharper focus, more done. Those things do come, but underneath them is something quieter and harder to name. The return of genuine preference. You start knowing what you actually think about things before the algorithm tells you what to think. You want specific things instead of just reaching for whatever's in front of you. You notice when something is actually interesting versus when it just has the surface texture of interesting. That distinction had been gone so long, most people stopped noticing it was missing. The Taoists would say you haven't gained anything new, you've just stopped losing what was always there. The mechanism isn't complicated once you see it. External stimulation scatters Shen. Scattered Shen costs you access to your own perception, and an environment built entirely around generating stimulation will keep producing that result regardless of how hard you try to resist it from the inside. The Taoists understood this 2,000 years before the problem reached its current scale, and their answer wasn't discipline, it was design. The single highest leverage thing you can do right now is identify the one input that pulls your attention out of your own hands earliest in the day and remove it from the first hour tomorrow morning. Not forever, just 1 hour. Let the water go still. If this way of looking at things connects with you, subscribe. There's a lot more where this came from, and every video goes deeper into how old ideas solve problems that newer ones keep missing.